right, guys, it is high noon and we're going to get started here. I am Tom Fulkerson. I am your qualifying broker. This is Broker Chat, and we are going to talk this morning about the flow and the use of the new GAR forms. And there's lots of changes. I hope that is everybody on this call, have you taken a GAR forms changes class so you're aware of the forms? Because my plan is not to get into the nitty gritty of the form, although I will if you have questions. But of what you should be using and when, and hopefully this will help you. So these are the changes to the commission, aka we are now using the word compensation, no more commission, paragraph in the seller's brokerage agreements. And the listing agents can negotiate the way the compensation they receive will be paid by the seller. And so you can either do a gross amount where you're taking, and I'm going to use these examples. They are not standards. I don't want anybody to assume that these are standard compensation rates, but I think these are rates that we are used to and accustomed to. So I'm going to use them because you are allowed to charge whatever you want to charge. So the gross method would be when we are, as a listing agent, taking our compensation of 6% and sharing it with the selling agent. So generally that's going to look like 6% and 3% to the selling agent. So that is what we call the gross compensation amount. And that's when the listing agent is sharing their portion and the buyer broker on a separate amount. Okay. So any conditions which would affect the amount that a buyer broker must be paid listed with the seller engagement and disclosed to buyer's broker. We would do that on the very first thing I want you to do when you get your listing agreement signed is have not only the affiliated business disclosure filled out, but also I would go ahead and get the seller to sign off on the pre-compensation showing agreement form. You're going to be hearing a whole lot about that. As of August the 11th, there will be no more advertising of compensation amounts in the multiple listing services. Although I think FMLS may be doing something that I'm not sure of yet that's been actually confirmed. So we're going to assume that compensation amounts for buyers brokers are not going to be advertised anywhere. And as part of Keller Williams, part of our new regional policies and procedures state that nor the market center nor the agent can advertise commission rates. So we need to be very, very careful about that. And I probably would make sure that you have plenty of the pre-compensation forms filled out and ready to send to people when they have a showing time. Have those at an open house or caravan. More importantly, a caravan. If you have agents coming in that may be interested in showing them that property, and you already have a pre-compensation form filled out and ready to go. Naruna, I will get to your question here shortly. So are there any questions so far on the pre-compensation form? I know, Jen, you had a question about that last week because it was still showing advertising in FMLS, and it will continue to be shown. However, guys, let me make it real clear. We just got finished with an arbitration with the Georgia Association of Realtors, where one of our agents put in an incorrect commission amount, FMLS. The agent saw it, printed it out, showed the property. it got changed back to what it was supposed to be, but they argued that the commission was advertised at a 3% when in fact it should have been a 2.5%. Long story short, our agent, even though the FMLS form says that the information is deemed accurate but not deemed reliable but not warrantable, the GAR found differently, and our agent had to cough up $2,500 out of their pocket to pay this other agent because they kept pushing the issue. So just because it's advertised currently doesn't mean that that's actually correct. Charlene, you have your hand up.
Yes, Tom, can we have this form attached to in the area where the disclosures are, or we just absolutely can't have it on FMLS at all?
Can't, or Georgia MLS at all, because it's advertised, it's showing what the commission is being advertised. So this is something that you're going to have to send out to agents as they make appointments to view your listing. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
No, same thing.
Okay. All right. Cool. So the second way you can fill out the compensation agreement with your seller is a net agreement where you would receive 3% and the buyer's agent would receive 3%, and the seller would sign off on it that way. Now, if that's the way it's structured, the new instructions to closing attorney form that goes to the attorney has a place for the seller's signature. So in this case, even though it's between the listing agent and the buyer's agent, since the listing agreement is filled out in a net to both parties, the seller has to sign off on that. And there's now a place on the instructions to closing attorney where the seller signs authorizing that he did agree to pay both listing agent and buyer's broker agent the 3%. Okay. Now I'm going to back up a bit. If the gross amount is used where you're taking the full 6% and sharing your commission, then the seller doesn't have to sign off on that because he's actually paying you, you're paying the other agent. Okay, does that make sense? Because that is something that's new. Okay. Stephen, can you go to the next slide, please? So this is an example, guys, of what we just spoke about, where the gross amount on the seller's brokerage agreement is filled out as 6% of the sales price, and we are sharing that with the buyer's broker at 3%. And that comes out of our total 6. In this case, when you send the instructions to closing attorney to the attorney, you do not have to have the seller sign off on it. If you all decided that your strategy was to fill this out at 3% to you and 3% to the buyer's broker, that's when the seller has to sign off on the instructions to closing attorney authorizing that he agreed to pay both parties 3%. We had a discussion about this at another office on Tuesday, and one of the closing attorneys was there speaking, and they gave incorrect information. So I want to make sure that you all get correct information because there's a lot of misinformation out there, and so this is the way it has to be done. All right, Stephen, will you move on to the next slide, please? Okay, the next slide, please. All right, this is our pre-showing compensation agreement. And also there are ways here to write in special stipulations. For example, if the compensation being offered to a buyer's broker is 3%. And the seller agrees that if the seller's broker shows the property to the buyer before the buyer's agent shows, the compensation is 1.5%. That's where you would write this in on this pre-showing compensation agreement. And the seller's broker, out of the compensation, seller is paying to the seller's broker. All right, so this is going to be a very important thing. You also start using this form right now. As we're reviewing contracts, we're starting to see this form being used. I've seen some of the forms where the agent's written in 3%. It's been countered back, slashed through and put 2%. Everybody initials and dates it. And that's how this form is working. All right, on to the next slide, please. All right, this is where it's signed, and the seller is signing this form as well on the pre-showing compensation agreement. I think best policy here is to go ahead and get these things signed by your seller when you get the listing agreement signed and the affiliated business disclosure signed. Go ahead and get this signed, make copies, and be able to ready to shoot it out to folks who make appointments to see your listing. All right, on to the next form, please, or next slide, please. All right, here is your exclusive buyer brokerage agreement form. And we're having lots of questions about this because it's can be a little confusing. Let's see, Lily Newman, is this Jen? Okay. If we are currently under contract with a buyer, so I lost your question here.
Should we go back?
If we are currently under contract with a buyer, should we, as the listing broker, go out and fill out the compensation form? Yeah, I would, just because I don't want there to be, right now, we're just trying to make sure there's no issues going to the closing table where there might be a misprint on an FMLS form or whatever. But I think best policy is to go ahead and get this form. And I have created a placeholder in your consultation folder in your command file for you to put that pre-compensation form in there, because I guarantee you that we're going to get a lot of calls. Know that many brokerages have not gone into the type of detailed training on this as we have. And so there's going to be a lot of confusion on people that you are dealing with, in my opinion. All right. So we went over the listing agreement and the broker compensation agreement. So if it's not practical for you to receive the pre-compensation agreement, we know there's going to be agents who aren't going to respond. We know that you may need to get in a hurry to go show a property, and you may not be able to get that pre-compensation file or form filled out before you go show the property. If that's the case, then the exhibit that we're showing right now, the broker compensation agreement, is what you would want to attach to your contract. All right. And in this case, we've labeled it Exhibit A with the address of the party, and the compensation of buyer's broker is, in this example, 3% of the purchase price being paid by the seller. And you would get this signed and attach it to your contract, and then it becomes part of your transaction. If you have a situation where you have this as part of your contract, you will not have to send the instructions to closing attorney. unless there's something that's not on this form, like an admin fee or something like that. But there is a special stipulation on this. And so my suggestion and Angie's suggestion is just do the math. So if you know you're going to get that on $100,000 property and you charge a $500 admin fee, then do the math and add that admin fee to your compensation here. You could put that as a dollar figure, and that way it goes to the closing attorney. The whole contract goes to the closing attorney, and we will not need the pre-showing or the instructions to closing attorney. Okay. Zena, you had your hand
Yes,
raised.
hi Tom. So
Hi,
for the
Zena.
hi, so for here we don't know if it's the seller or the seller's broker. So should we ask or just put seller always?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand your question.
Here on the screen, the 3%, the
Yeah.
compensation of buyer's broker shall be paid by seller, but sometimes it's the seller broker is based on their listing agreement, correct?
It's going to be based on their listing agreement, but if we don't have access to their listing agreement,
Exactly.
and if we didn't get them to send us a copy of the pre-compensation pre-showing compensation GAR form, then we would add this to our contract, and we will assume that we're going to get in this case 3%. And if in fact the compensation is less than that, then they will counteroffer, scratch through that 3, add whatever. The one I did see went from 3 to 2, and everybody initialed and dated it. And so, but you will not need to add this to your contract if you get the pre-showing compensation form, because it's already going to have the compensation that you're going to receive along with the seller's signature on it.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome. That's why in the meeting on Tuesday that I was at, they were like, the attorney was like, you need to add this to all your contracts. No, you do not. If you have a pre-showing compensation form signed by the listing agent and the seller, you will not need to add this to your GAR form purchase and sale agreement. But if you do not have that agreement, the pre-compensation showing agreement, and we know people, guys, we know that there's going to be times where you're going to want to get into a house sooner than later, and the listing agent's dragging their feet and not communicating with you. We have another solution, and this is the solution. We will add it to the contract. So just know that that's the case here. All right, Stephen, Jen says, do we need to add the pre-comp agreement to the purchase and sale as an exhibit? You do not need to do that because it's already been signed by the seller agreeing to pay you. That's what I would send to the closing attorney in lieu of the instructions to closing attorney. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, here's an example of the instructions to closing attorney that this attorney on Tuesday said was no longer necessary. Guys, it is necessary. And so here on this instructions, the compensation to the seller's broker is 6%, and we're sharing that with 3%. And in this case, the seller does not need to sign it. Can we go to the next slide to show the second part of this, please, Stephen? Here we go. So here's the changes, guys. And so down at the bottom, the seller's signature is required if, in fact, the listing agreement is 3% to the listing agent and 3% to the buyer's agent. If that's the case, then the seller needs to sign it. In this example that I have here, the seller's paying the listing agent 6%, and we're sharing that commission at a 3% rate. So we don't need the seller's signature on here. That's what I wanted to distinguish and make sure you all understood. And we won't know that if we don't get a pre-showing compensation agreement form prior to going under contract, and then we have to add the exhibit showing who is receiving what in terms of compensation. We will need this instructions to closing attorney to send it because we don't have that pre-showing compensation agreement. Okay. If you have the pre-showing compensation agreement, send that along with your contract to the closing attorney, and that's all they will need. And you will not need the instructions to closing attorney as we're showing right here. All right, any questions about that? All right, this is from Trina. Hi, Trina. What would be a reason that a seller would pay the buyer's broker directly?
Like, is it just is it to make it, 3%, the 3% sounds less to that? Is that what what would the reason be?
It's just a strategy that some agents are going to use because they could say, all right, you're going to pay me 3% regardless. I'm the listing agent. And you're going to pay a buyer's agent 3%. But there may be a special stipulation saying that if there's no buyer brokerage agreement, then you're going to pay me 4% and nothing to the buyer's broker because there is none. Or if you're going to pay me 3% and we're going to pay a buyer's broker 3%, but I show the property first, then the buyer's broker would only get 1.5%. So it's a negotiating tool based on people parachuting in on a transaction and a full 3%. So these forms are designed for to give special stipulations to different scenarios that you may face as a listing agent. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
I think what we're going to see, guys, mainly is going to be 6%. This would cover dual agency, correct? That's from Jen. I think what we're really going to see, guys, mainly on these listing agreements, in my opinion, is still going to be the usual old way of 6% sharing 3%, with a special stipulation that says if I show the buyer first, then your commission is going to be 1.5%. I think that's what we're probably going to see. But, these forms are designed now to give you flexibility in negotiating with a seller and coming up with different scenarios to discuss with them just to make sure that it's a smooth transaction. Everybody's on the same page, because everybody's going to be reading the fact that they don't have to pay a buyer's broker anymore. And our job is to share with them why you feel it's important or not important. And then we go from there. This is from Kay to everyone. Is there a stip we can add in the case where our seller agrees to pay the buyer's brokerage? Hold on, let me get to the chat. Cut off. Is there a stip that we can add in the case where our sellers agree to pay buyer's brokerage if buyer isn't paying their agent? Could that be stated? Well, I think what we need to do is just notify the seller that there are two special stipulations, 619 and 620, one for conventional, one for VA, where the buyer can ask the seller to pay their broker's compensation on their behalf. Those forms still exist. It's not something that you would put in a listing agreement, but it's part of the discussion you're going to have with your sellers and with your buyers when you go to sign a brokerage agreement with those folks. And the seller adamantly says, I don't want to pay a buyer's broker commission on this listing agreement. And you need to remind them that there are more than likely they could be asked to pay with a special stipulation in the contract. And that's special stipulation 619, which is for VA, and 620 for conventional. Any other questions on these? So here's what I want you to think about, guys. The flow. The flow is we sit down, we have a professional buyer consultation, we present them with our value proposition and what they're going to benefit from us representing them in a real estate transaction. We're going to have the buyer brokerage agreement signed. We're going to agree on what they're going to pay us. If the seller does not pay us, we're going to review the fact that they can ask the seller to pay the compensation on a special stipulation. If the listing agent doesn't send you a pre-showing compensation agreement, you can write it into the contract on the exhibit that we went over today. And then we would send we would negotiate through that. And then we would send the closing attorney the instructions to closing attorney after that. If we are a listing agent, we're going to sit down, do the same process, and get the listing agreement signed. You, as the listing agent, are going to decide if you want to sell them on a 6% gross and pay the buyer's broker X amount and alter that depending on if they show who shows the property first or what the special circumstances are maybe around that showing. And you're going to have your pre-compensation agreement forms filled out. I would suggest that you do that, because if this exhibit becomes part of the purchase and sale agreement, I just don't want that to put anybody in a compromising position where the seller may now decide to negotiate your commission as well. That's why they took it out to begin with several years ago. But I think it would be best practice for you just to have, as a listing agent, those pre-compensation agreement forms filled out and ready to send out when you get a showing time request. And then if you have a caravan, you can certainly hand those out at your caravan. We just can't advertise it in the MLS any way, shape, or form.
That's right.
Push, 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 push.
Somebody needs to mute themselves. All right. Does that help you all understand a little bit about the flow of these agreements? Trina, I know you and I had a one-on-one and talked through a lot of the questions that you had. Are you pretty clear on this now?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Okay, good. Jen, I know that you had some questions about this too. Do you have any questions, or are you pretty clear now?
No, I think it's a lot more clear. It's just all like a CYA, like where do we cover our asses the most, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We are
thank you.
adhering to a major lawsuit, and that's why we are talking about all of this.
Thank you. Yeah.
I also wanted to bring up, just so for you all who do not know or may not have been on my broker chat several weeks ago, about the affiliated business disclosure. There is a new standard affiliated business disclosure for the Heart of Atlanta Group. We are asking you to, when you are sitting down with your buyer or with your seller, to please get those signed by your client when you're getting your listing agreement signed. And if you're a listing agent, your pre-compensation agreement signed. Get all that done right now. And if you've got a listing where you are actually taking 3 and offering the seller or the buyer's agent 3, I would go ahead and get the seller to sign off on the instructions to closing attorney so that's all done. Okay. That's your best practice. And that way you have all your forms ready to go when you need them and you don't have to wait on your seller. Yeah, Manny, CYA, and making sure when are presented in the form the other side, you are in the know, even if they are not. Yes, sir. That is absolutely correct. And trust me, guys, you're going to have a lot of agents you're going to be working with that don't understand this, that are going to get it wrong. And we want you all to be the experts and making sure that not only you understand, how to fill out the form, but the flow of how these are used. I think that's what I really wanted to accomplish with you today. Anyway, back to the affiliated business disclosure. We need these forms filled out. We can ask the other party to sign off on them. It is a disclosure, nothing more, nothing less. It's not affecting their pocketbook. But I do know that some of the other parties do not want to sign your affiliated business disclosure, and we cannot make them. But if you can't get the other party to sign, please make a note in your command file that it was presented and they refused to sign it. And that way we have a CYA in our file in case we but it should be signed by your client first when you're having your professional meeting with them, and then offer it to your co-op partner as part of what we would ask them to sign off on. And I had an example this morning of one of our Decatur agents who wanted to use a particular law firm, and the other party was insistent that they use their law firm. And then, oh, by the way, after the contract went binding, here's an affiliated business disclosure we'd like you to sign. And that's a little too late at that point. You've already got a binding contract, because I don't know what their business relationship is with this closing attorney, but it should have been disclosed up front before the contract was ever agreed to. So please don't be that agent. Please get these things signed up front and logical, because quite frankly, a client has the duty, and it's ultimately their decision to say, well, I may not want to use your closing attorney if you're getting what they may consider a kickback. And so we have to be very, very careful about that, particularly in light of the NAR lawsuit. And we just want to be upfront, and we want to be professional, and we want to make sure that everybody is aware of their options. Okay, any other questions, guys? Okay, well, I thank you for joining me on Broker Chat today, and I hope everybody has a fabulous rest of your day and a great week, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.